It was 1988, and a group of scientists just released their carbon-14 dating on the Shroud of Turin and said it dated to the Middle Ages, basically declaring it was a fake. And that was it for me. I mentally filed it away as another Catholic relic faked for or by the church, and I thought I would never think about it ever again. But recent scientific developments and the publishing of Jeremiah Johnston's new book, The Jesus Discoveries, have made me wonder, is there more to the story? So join me as we discuss the Shroud today and what it means for Christianity on today's episode. Welcome to the Mamapologist. This is a safe place for your doubts. Here, apologetics meets discipleship. So join me as we learn to think biblically about how to walk through this life as believers, struggling with tough questions, seeking hope, and finding answers together. Now, the word I used to use for the Shroud of Turin was unbelievable. I really never looked past those carbon dating results in 1988, and I really haven't given it a second thought. But in the past couple of years, I've seen some scientific evidence that suggests that maybe we jumped to conclusions writing it off too quickly. Now, for time's sake, I'm not going to cover every single part of the Shroud and every single discovery. I'm just going to kind of summarize so that we can talk about the important part we all should think about. So the basics are the main scientific inquiry that is kind of the foundation for everything that's being done now, started with the Shroud of Turin research project in 1976 to 78. The main group went over in 78. One of the scientists was a photographer. He specialized in medical and scientific photography. His name was Barry Schwartz. He's actually the person who has done the TED Talk on the Shroud. He was a Jewish skeptic. He is now a Christian. Well, he passed away. The researchers went to the Shroud of Turin. They were given access for a short period of time. I think it was only 5 days. And they ended up sleeping in shifts around the clock so that they didn't lose a single second of their time with the Shroud. They used cutting-edge imaging techniques to reveal as much information about the Shroud as possible. They also used other investigative techniques like microchemical analysis and even sticky tape. Now, Schwartz in his TED Talk says that they realized pretty quickly that the Shroud was not a painting. It was not a scorch, and it was not a photograph. So what did the team conclude? In their official results, they said, "We can conclude for now that the Shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. And the image is an ongoing mystery. And until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved." So they didn't come to a conclusion, but they did decide that it couldn't have been a painting, which I think is important because that is one of the major claims against it, is that it is a medieval forgery, some form of painting. Now, Schwartz himself didn't believe until 1995. The blood on the Shroud is actually fairly bright red, considering its age, and blood doesn't usually stay red. When the blood expert on the Shroud of Turin project, Alan Adler, told him that the blood had stayed red due to the high levels of bilirubin, that kind of sealed the deal for him. That was that last piece of evidence that he's like, okay, I think it makes sense now. Now, there are more modern studies that argue that the bilirubin isn't actually the reason the blood stayed red, but it could have been exposure to UV rays or some form of neutron radiation. But the issue still is the same. The blood is real blood. It's not painted on, it's not forged. It is real blood that has maintained its color due to extenuating circumstances of some sort. One of the other things that the team found using the sticky tape was pollen samples. They found a variety of pollen samples, but at least 38 of those pollen samples on the cloth are pollen that would have been only accessible in the area of Jerusalem during the springtime. In fact, the most frequent pollen on the shroud is identical to the most frequent pollen in the sediments of the Lake of Gennesaret, sedimentary layers of 2,000 years ago. And that was from Emanuela Marinelli, who is a shroud expert with multiple degrees in several scientific fields, and she has spent a lifetime lecturing on the shroud. Now, the 20 other samples that they found actually kind of trace the shroud's journey through France and Italy because the pollen samples match plants on known locations of the shroud. Dust samples from the foot area of the cloth that were found using the same sticky tape procedure matched mineral analysis of limestone dust samples from tombs in Jerusalem from that time period. Specifically, they show calcium carbonate from travertine aragonite limestone. So we've got pollen samples, we've got the dust samples that are specific to the area that seem to line up. The blood red color, there's a reason why it's red, and it's not because it's faked. It is real blood. Back to the 1988 carbon-14 dating. This is a whole rabbit hole we don't really have time to go down, but I can boil it down for you pretty simply. The sample that we used to test was not homogeneous. Now, it took a long time for that information to be released to the public. We don't have what they tested to know what that means, but we know that it means the sample was not consistent with the main sections of the cloth and probably included a portion that had been patched. We know for a fact that the cloth had been patched at least, I think, 6 or 7 times that we can document due to various damage, fires, things like that. The nuns very carefully wove patches into the cloth so it's virtually indistinguishable. However, the portion that they took to test was most likely from a medieval patch, which is why it dated to the Middle Ages. So the original carbon-14 dating is at least faulty and to be questioned. So I think it's worth going down the rabbit hole to see, well, when was it dated then? In April of 2022, a team of scientists published a study in Heritage. Now, Heritage is an international peer-reviewed open access journal of cultural and natural heritage science. So in this journal that's been peer-reviewed, they used a new dating method called wide-angle X-ray scattering. Now that dates ancient linen threads by inspecting their structural degradation. How much has it broken down over time? And they found that the shroud is 20 centuries old using this method. And they accounted for the temperature and the humidity, how much light it would have been exposed to, all sorts of variables. And they found that it's about 2,000 years old, which dates it right to the time of when it would have been if it's the burial cloth of Jesus. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's Jesus, but it does date it to the right time period. But how was the image created? And the short answer is we have no idea. We still can't recreate the image, even with all of our modern technology. One of the interesting facts that I've learned in my research is that the image is actually on top of the blood, as if the blood had soaked into the cloth before the image was created. The chances of someone being able to fake that is pretty slim. If chemicals had been used, the chemicals would have soaked into the cloth much deeper than the image actually is. The image is 0.2 microns deep. Very, very shallow image. Now, a research scientist, Paulo de Lazaro, he wrote a paper called The Shroud-like Coloration of Linen by Ultraviolet Radiation. He is the chief of research at the ENEA Research Center. Now, what they did was they used ultraviolet radiation and they pulsed it at a linen, and they used similar linen to the shroud to see if it would create the effect that's on the shroud. And what they found was that they could reproduce a similar effect by using the radiation pulses. And it wouldn't scorch the cloth. I had done it quick pulses. But in order to create an image like was on the shroud, he said the amount of energy would have been 34 billion watts of energy. And the pulse would have had to be 1/40th of a billionth of a second. So while we have a possible method of creating the image, we don't have the ability to actually create the image. We have the ability to discolor the cloth in a tiny little section. I think the section they used was about the size of a palm of a hand. The shroud is 14 feet long. It is double-sided, the front of a person and the back of a person, because the way that they would have used the shroud would have been to lay it this way, the person like this, and then fold it over the top. And then they would have used some cloths to wrap around it to secure the hands and close the jaw, things like that, to maintain dignity of the body. So we have this 14-foot long shroud that has this image imprinted on it that would have required 34 billion watts of electricity. Now, that's more than all the power plants on the entire globe can produce. I think Jeremiah Johnston said it was about 4 times the amount of energy on the entire planet, and delivered at a speed that's beyond our wildest capabilities. Now, from a theological perspective, what's interesting is that we know that Jesus is going to be the light in heaven. When we read in Revelation about what the new Jerusalem will look like, there's not going to be a sun. We won't need a sun because we're going to have the Son of God, and he is going to be our light. So the idea that Jesus' new resurrected body made the equivalent of a nuclear explosion, or at least a nuclear event of some sort, isn't outside of our theological beliefs. That's certainly possible. But whatever made the image, we can't reproduce it. In fact, there was an atheist filmmaker named David Rolfe, and he set out to make a documentary about the shroud because he thought it was a fake. And the more he researched it, the more he was convinced it wasn't. He's now a Christian, and in a Mirror article in 2024, he has offered $1 million prize to anyone who can recreate the shroud with all of its elements without showing any traces of ink, paint, or other agents. But it has to contain all the elements, which includes the pollen and the dust and the blood that is found on the shroud with every other detail. Now, many people argue that it could be a medieval forgery because we don't know where it came from before the 1350s. Now, some historians believe that it could be the image of Edessa or the Mendelin. I'm not sure if that's how you say that. But these were 2 historical images that were displayed in various times and described as being not made by human hands. We know that the image was transferred from Edessa to Constantinople in 944, but we don't know where it was for about 150 years after the Fourth Crusade in 1204. So we don't catch up to it until the 1350s in France. And it makes several stops between Liry, France, and Turin, Italy, that we can document, but we don't have the history going all the way back to the time of Jesus. We call that the provenance, when you have a piece of art or historical artifact that you can trace the ownership all the way back. And we don't have that. So despite not having the direct provenance all the way to the cross, we can have some encouragement that there were historical sources that may have mentioned it before it was called the Shroud of Turin. Now, I would argue that there are some reasons why it being a forgery doesn't make a lot of sense. For one, the blood tested on the shroud came back as AB. Now, the way we test ancient blood isn't always 100% certain. So we have to take this with a modicum of skepticism. But the test did show AB blood, which is a Semitic blood type. And it's one of the rarest blood types in the world, with only about 4 to 5% of the world's population having that blood type. Blood types weren't discovered until 1900. So no one prior to 1900 would have known to make a forgery using a specific blood type. Scholars argue that the blood identified on the shroud also shows characteristics of being wounds and postmortem wounds. And we can see the difference, especially the separation of the blood and water on the side where the spear wound was. Again, medieval forgeries would not have known that there would be a way to test for differences between antemortem or premortem blood and postmortem blood. They wouldn't have been able to forge that. They would have gotten some of the details wrong in the depiction of the figure. Because medieval art, if you look at medieval art, you see a tiny little ring for the crown of thorns. It's looked like a slender little wreath. And we can tell by the wounds on the shroud that this would have been like a helmet of thorns. Why would a medieval forger have gone against what every artistic rendering of the crucifixion looked like to create this image that was totally different? A medieval forgery also would have misplaced the location of the nails and would have put it through the palm of the hand, which we know would not have supported the weight of the body, and it was more likely through the wrist area. So that would have been incorrect on a forged piece. The shroud also doesn't look like a dead body would have looked on cloth. If the image had been made by a dead body, we should have seen decomposition and decay, and there was none. In fact, the body shows like it was in a state of rigor mortis, which only usually lasts about 40 hours. And we know that Jesus was only in the tomb for 39 hours. So that's a piece of evidence to kind of file away. We also know that the image, when they put it through a 3D image analyzer, I think it's called a VP8 image analyzer, that the picture of the shroud created this 3D image. And the perspective and alignment of that image was accurate. It aligns with the shroud being an imprint of a resurrection event rather than an imprint of a death. So Jeremiah Johnson describes how this shroud may have come into existence is through the resurrection event, which would have created a different image than a decomposing body would have relayed on an image. He describes it as what might have been like a nuclear event and the body passing through the cloth. As Jesus was restored to a new body that had new properties, we know that he appears in locked rooms after resurrection, but still can eat food and still can be touched in his solid body. So we don't understand what that might be like. But the shroud being imprinted, remember that 1/40th of a billionth of a second with 34 billion watts of energy would have instantly just transformed through that cloth and maybe left this very shallow imprint on the cloth. Now, can I pause and interrupt you for a second? If you're enjoying this podcast, please like, follow, subscribe, leave a review. It helps get the truth in front of more people who need to be encouraged that there are good reasons for what we believe and why we believe it. Thank you. Now, that all sounds really convincing if you're a Christian and want to believe in the Shroud of Turin, but it's not a done deal. I am not 100% convinced. There are experts out there that have written articles on the bleeding patterns or on the blood itself and various other aspects of the shroud that appear reasonable, that appear relatively objective. And they claim that the claims of the shroud experts are aggrandized or hyperbolic. And basically, it comes down to this: Christians are going to see what they want to see, and skeptics are going to see what they want to see. Both sides can seem reasonable, but only one can be true. So here's where I stand. Some of the alternate theories or the rebuttals of the shroud are convincing on their own. If you just look at the blood and look at this study, if you just look at the pollen, maybe this is convincing. If you just look at the dating, maybe this is convincing. But none of the theories explain the image that we can't reproduce. And if you know how, please tell me I could use that $1 million. But none of them explain all the pieces put together. Much like we talked about last week on the resurrection, only the resurrection explains everything we do know. Why were the disciples so radically changed? Why was Jesus' brother going from skeptic to believer? Why did Paul go from a persecutor of Christians to the leader of the Gentile church? And why was the tomb empty? There are lots of theories that explain pieces of those things, but only one explains all of them, and that's the resurrection. And I feel a little bit like that's the same story with the shroud. Only the shroud being real, meaning being accurate to a crucified man of that time period, and being the resurrection cloth of Jesus Christ, makes the most sense of all the pieces. The blood staying red over time, being exposed to a bright light, the pollen being from Jerusalem, the dust being from Jerusalem, the correct wound patterns, the new dating based on the wide angle X-ray scattering, the image itself's existence. Only this being really the shroud of Jesus answers all of those questions. But that still doesn't make it 100% the shroud that Jesus came back to life in. I'm not 100% convinced. And I'm never going to hang my faith on such an item. I think it's exciting. I think it's interesting. But I don't think it's where we should place our hope. And that's what I really want to talk to you about for just a few more minutes. I say that this podcast is about apologetics, but it's also about discipleship. And what I've seen is that when we place our faith in the wrong things, it can be devastating. At the end of the day, our faith is in the real person of Jesus Christ, not any relic, even a real one. If Jesus left us this remnant to bolster our faith, it's wonderful. It's excellent. But if it's a forgery, it doesn't change what we believe about the resurrection from the evidence that we do have, both from the Bible and from history. And if we let our faith be in artifacts or relics or charismatic leaders or the results we get from changing our life, we're going to risk losing our faith when the leader turns out to be human and sins, when our life doesn't go the way we want, when an artifact or relic turns out to be a forgery. And we don't want our faith to be shipwrecked when people turn out to be people and do people-y things. When scientists interpret data differently. I've spent this whole week researching the shroud, reading study after study and seeing, yes, it's real. No, it's not. Yes, it's real. No, it's not. Again, science doesn't say anything, as Frank Turek likes to say. Scientists do. And we have to understand that scientists have bias because they're human just like we are. So even after a deep dive this week, reading all the information, I'm left with questions. I've gotten some answers, but I'm still left with questions. And I think that it's important for us as believers to recognize the difference between fun things to investigate, hopeful things to investigate, while still hanging our faith on Jesus. Because he needs to be the cornerstone of your faith more than anything else. And I've seen too many Christians lose their faith over something small that doesn't really matter or doesn't really disprove Christianity at all. But it shook their trust because they put their trust in the wrong place. So keep your trust in Jesus. It's okay to investigate it, and it's okay to hope that this piece of cloth truly shows us the face of Jesus. A fantastic site to help you dive into this issue for yourself is athonia.org, or read The Jesus Discoveries by Jeremiah Johnston. That's climbing the New York Times bestseller list. I recently got to hear him speak in person, and he's very convincing. And he is clearly convinced that this is the real deal. You can watch him on the Sean Ryan Show, or Live Free with Josh Howerton, or Cross-Examined with Frank Turek. All of those podcasts are really powerful, and he reveals different things in each one that add to the case that the shroud is legitimate. One of the things I think is interesting is that a few years ago, Dr. Johnston said on Sean McDowell's podcast that he thought the shroud was a fake. And I think he's going to be revisiting his new findings with Sean very soon. I'm going to be looking forward to that episode. So whether you're convinced or not, the shroud is important for one reason, because it's a reminder that our God has a face. Our God became human, and he lived in a human body, and he died for us. One of the realizations that I had this week was that the curse in Genesis, when Adam and Eve sinned, the initial curse was that the ground would produce thorns. And Jesus literally wears that curse. He takes it upon himself and wears it for us and nails it to the cross with our sin. That's pretty powerful. He did that because of how much he loves you, how much he loves me. Mathematician Bruno Barbaris said the chances of the image on the shroud not being Jesus is 1 in 200 billion, because of all the details that align with the specific details from the Gospels. Now, whether the shroud is genuine or not, the wounds are real, and the shroud represents those wounds accurately. And I'm going to hold on to the fact that it is a powerful reminder of how much Jesus loves me. Jeremiah Johnston calls it an itemized receipt. We can see the marks on his body. In fact, the Athonia exhibit was here when Jeremiah came to speak, and they have created a bronze replica of the man from the shroud using 3D imagery. And you can touch this bronze statue. And I was able to place my fingers in the nail holes. There was something powerful about doing that and remembering that even if the shroud isn't real, my Jesus is. And the price he paid was real. I'm going to build my faith on that, while still hoping that the shroud has shown me the face of my Savior. Until next time, keep seeking truth, hold fast to faith, never be afraid to ask the hard questions, because God has answers.